Thank you for turning out at 8:30 for this session, and my thanks to our two panelists for coming out early in the proceedings for this conversation about biopharmaceuticals and the Inflation Reduction Act. Encourage folks to move up to the front if you'd like. My name's Tom Hubbard. I am Senior Vice President of an organization called NEHI, Network for Excellence in Health Innovation. It's a basically small health policy think tank headquartered in Boston. MGB is a charter member of NEHI, and we are focused on issues of innovation in American healthcare from the standpoint of wherever we can find, if not common ground, at least some common interest across the sectors of U.S. healthcare: payers, providers, patient advocates, biopharma, pharmacy, et cetera. So I'm delighted and personally grateful this morning to have Dr. Steve Pearson and Dr. Peter Newman on the panel. I think it's safe to say you are both two of the more prominent voices in the ongoing discussion and debate in the country around drug pricing, drug launches, and innovation. And this morning, what we've asked Steve and Peter to do is talk with us a little bit about the implementation, the ongoing implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, and specifically the provisions focused on drugs in Medicare, and what you're seeing, what you're not seeing, the policy choices that CMS seems to be making so far. And as I think I've discussed with a couple of you, this is probably all still in the guise of informed speculation, because as you folks in the audience probably know well, implementation of the drug pricing, and for that matter, the drug benefit redesign provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act in Medicare is on a very fast implementation time frame. It's not going through what would otherwise be a sort of normal, or what we've seen in the past anyway, in terms of rulemaking and guidance. And on the drug pricing side, it's on its way to absent anything that might happen in a federal court, it's on its way to September 1st, when the first list of 10 drugs that Medicare intends to price negotiate will come out. As folks may have seen, the first lawsuit around all this appeared last week from Merck. There's at least one other lawsuit that seems to be on its way from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. There may be others, but this discussion is going to assume that we're on our way to a September 1st release of that initial drug list. Before I turn to Peter and Steve, let me maybe tee this up a little bit with a very quick recap of what's germane here in the Inflation Reduction Act. And first, just mention that, again, as you folks may know, there's a considerable amount of Medicare benefit redesign in the Inflation Reduction Act that's ranges from the elimination as of January 1st of this year of patient or beneficiary cost sharing for vaccines covered in Medicare Part D. So shingles vaccinations do no longer have a cost sharing obligation for beneficiaries. Quite famously, the cost of insulin has been capped at $35 a month for beneficiaries who use insulin. Premium growth in Part D is being capped to 6%, at least through the next 6 years. And total out-of-pocket spending for Part D beneficiaries is being capped at $2,000. So one of the stories that's playing out here is how beneficiaries are reacting to that, whether we're going to be seeing or maybe already seeing greater uptake, greater medication adherence among Medicare beneficiaries who have Part D prescription drug benefit coverage. This discussion this morning is more focused on what manufacturers are being asked to do or required to do under the Inflation Reduction Act. And so again, the Inflation Reduction Act for the first time gives Medicare the authority to, and I know the term in our second panel may be debated a little bit, the term negotiation may be debated, but it gives them the authority to negotiate drug prices for drugs that represent high spending categories or cause a high spend level for Medicare. So the September 1st list that will come out will be 10 drugs that CMS will choose based on the total aggregate cost of those drugs to Medicare, and other lists of 10 drugs will follow in succeeding years. I'll mention real quickly the criteria, the categories of criteria that CMS is deploying as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act to determine an initial so-called maximum fair price, MFP, for these drugs. One is the manufacturer's R&D costs and the extent to which they've been recouped. So manufacturers are having to report data on their R&D costs, also their current costs of production and distribution, data on prior federal financial support for development of novel therapies, if it's a novel therapy in question, data on pending and approved patent status on the drugs, other market data relating to the market performance of the drugs, evidence about alternative treatments, including the extent to which the drug represents a therapeutic advance. And related to that, data, or CMS will be looking at comparative effectiveness of the drug and its therapeutic alternatives, including the impact on specific populations, such as disabled patients and others. They'll be looking at prescribing information that may be relevant to making this decision, and that's it. I think I hit the 9 criteria. So just mention real quickly what's excluded, and this may be something we want to touch on as well. The law says that orphan drugs will not be negotiated, or plasma-derived products. The initial list that comes out in September will be focused on Part D, prescription drug benefit drugs. Part B, physician-administered drugs, won't be negotiated for another, well, till 2028. Small molecule drugs are, new small molecule drugs are exempted from the negotiation for the first 9 years they're on the market. Biologics are excluded for 13 years. And this has emerged as a major issue, as we'll hear, I'm sure, in this panel, and particularly in the second panel. And those are basically the highlights, I think, of what we want to touch on today. So at the risk of sort of starting this discussion in almost in a backwards manner, I spoke with Steve and Peter, previously, and as I mentioned, a lot of this will be necessarily informed speculation. There is more guidance that CMS intends to issue about all this over the course of the summer, but we're, 2.5 months away now from this initial list being published. So at the risk of being a little bit backwards in the discussion, I thought the first question I would ask both of you is, what is it that is not known yet about the implementation of this program that you think is most important, or you're most anxious to know in the run-up to September 1st? And invite Peter, if you want to respond first. I mean, what's missing so far that you're anxious to hear about from CMS?
Right. Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and for all the good work you and the organization do, and great to be with Steve. First, let me say, I don't envy CMS here. They have got a lot to do. The timelines are very tight. Congress has been prescriptive in some ways, but has given CMS quite a bit of discretion in other ways, and they've got to figure this out. I am very, like everyone, very eager to see how they actually go about this process. CMS is basically being asked to be a health technology assessment organization of sorts, but a very different kind of HTA organization than we typically see. Why? Well, because they're going to be negotiating drug prices many years after drugs are launched. Usually HTA bodies will negotiate prices to the extent they do, or at least put out information to inform those negotiations at the launch of a drug. There'll be a lot more information available, a lot more information from real-world evidence, for example. How will CMS choose the comparator? Will be very interesting to see, and often is a judgment call. Sometimes there are multiple comparators. People have very different opinions about the comparator, and there's different levels of evidence about the comparator. CMS will have to judge whether the drug under negotiation has a therapeutic benefit compared to the alternative. Well, what will that mean? Presumably, it will mean, does it have a clinical benefit? And they will look at that, but that's sometimes not always clear. But what about other kinds of potential benefits and harms, for that matter? Does the new drug have better tolerability or better safety profile? Does it offset costs? Will CMS consider offsets of costs? In theory, they can, but we really won't know until we see what CMS actually does in these negotiations. There are many other issues, and I'm sure we'll get into them. Will CMS adopt some kind of framework? Germany has a framework where they look at clinical benefit, and then they categorize drugs according to the magnitude of the clinical benefit. Will CMS adopt some kind of framework like that? And finally, CMS is not permitted to use QALYs, quality adjusted life years. That's in the law itself. But possibly they can use cost effectiveness analysis without QALYs. And Steve, I'm sure, will mention this as well. There are other metrics you might use in a cost effectiveness analysis. And there are many issues about what should be included, what might be excluded. CMS might stay away from that. And I think we'll see what CMS does in the short term, but there are many issues to see about how it evolves over time. So I'll stop there.
Sure. Yeah, Steve?
Yeah, that was, also thank you for the invitation.
And by the way, I apologize because in doing the discussion backwards, I neglected to say anything about your organizations, and so please feel free to mention, but Steve Pearson, founder and president of ICER.
Peter and I both represent the kind of value assessment side of the family. There are many others at the table here as people talk about this. And I guess I would encourage people to take a big step back, because the methods are always intended to meet an ultimate purpose conceptually. And that still hasn't been made totally clear by Medicare. So for instance, you could assume that their job is to try to do this health technology assessment where they compare and really get down into the weeds about how this drug compares to another drug. And we're going to give 5% if it's 5% better, and come up with some quasi-quantitative approach. Because that is what HTA looks like in Europe. And, but as Peter said, that's usually done, or essentially always done, at launch. Because conceptually the idea is that's when we give the pharmaceutical industry a blank check through a patent, through exclusivity. And in this country, we still do. We say, you get to pick your price. You can think about the competitive landscape or whatever else you want to think about, but you get to pick that price. Whereas in Europe, they say, no, that's where we need some kind of value assessment to create some kind of boundary so that we're not spending so much on new things that we end up not being able to do perhaps even more valuable other services in our relatively limited healthcare system. That's one kind of paradigm. The other, though, and again, remember, we are not looking at launch. We're looking, let's just say, 10 years out. Why? Well, because conceptually, some congressmen even said, we don't want to risk the impact on innovation by regulating price at launch. But 10 years later, isn't that when they're supposed to have a generic, kind of? Wasn't that the social deal? That you get your pricing, but then we get the better pricing for the long term? And if that's not happening, then let's swoop in and fix that. And if that is your primary view of what this is all about, you don't really care that much about how much better it is, a little bit better than another drug. You kind of want to say, what does the generic price usually look like? Oh, it's usually about 35 to 50% lower. Okay, that's where we're going to bid. They're going to say 50% lower without really showing a formula or an equation or A plus B plus C or anything like that. And then they're going to say 50% off to you, biopharmaceutical company. And then the company is challenged with what do they come back with? Do they come back with the fine-tuned HTA approach where we're a little bit better, we're a little bit safer, whatever, and they came up with another number, and the second that happens, believe it or not, you've got negotiation. You've got two numbers on the table, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a reason to think that CMS would like to have a relatively qualitative, they've even used that term, approach. Doesn't mean that they can't have quantitative boundaries, but within some range, perhaps, they're going to be very qualitative because it allows them to think more broadly about their ultimate goal of seeking a facsimile of generic price and to do what looks like negotiation. Now, again, I know there are strongly held opinions about whether that really feels like negotiation or not, when at the end of the day, the penalties are so high, et cetera, the courts will hear all of this. But I still think even when we see the black and white of the final protocol for how they're going to negotiate, it's still going to look like they're going to look at 10 things and then a number will appear. And we really won't know how this plays out until that phase happens later this year and early into next year. And there are other issues. Comparators are absolutely critical. Even what's a drug, the moiety, this form of it versus that form. There are huge fights going on over that. And there'll be fights even over this value assessment piece, but ultimately that may play a much smaller role than I think many people fear or other people might hope in what is ultimately going to happen, at least in the first year.
Well, Steve, on that point, and before maybe diving into that in a little more detail, I think you, if I'm not mistaken, you recently sort of surmised that in this first go-round, CMS might not really apply value assessment at all, if I understand. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that, or what you meant by that.
Well, again, we're in a strange zone where, again, I'm very strongly stereotyping things that are going on. But the biopharmaceutical industry is doing two things. They are attacking the very fundamental validity of the law, while also arguing that if you're going to do it, make sure that you capture all the different forms of value of our drug and not forget any. So they're kind of doing two things, or at least preparing for two different futures, if you will. Cost effectiveness is usually the core tool used by many HTA groups. You don't have to, but it's a very core tool to create a quantitative and, in a sense, both transparent and consistent way to scale pricing to the added benefits. Again, the Germans do it differently. The French do a little bit of a hybrid. The English are much more on the cost effectiveness side. So there are different ways to do this. But in the very first year, they are so flat out in Washington trying to get this done that they don't have the staff yet. They don't have the ability to commission a kind of a portfolio yet. And so I honestly think it's going to look like a blender where whatever they can do in the short term, and also whatever people throw in, over the transom, because there's a public comment that can include the companies as well as the public, they can take anything that comes in by October 2nd and factor that in. So they may factor in some versions of cost effectiveness if it's given to them, not commissioned at this stage. But again, they're already being very public about the idea that what we're going to see in this first cycle will not be what they anticipate happening every year, because they have to iterate and grow and evolve as they get their own experience and as, again, some of their own thinking around the public comment on their draft protocol and other things play out.
Because there's various versions out in public. I'm sure there's a lot in private of what the likely drugs might be, and I think we probably can expect any number of drugs on the ultimate list to be drugs that have been out for quite a while. Peter, to your point, right? So there's a long pricing history around those drugs. There is basically an opportunity for CMS, at least in the first year, to basically sort of take a automatic discount kind of approach. They're not here, and that's sort of the muscle memory of federal program pricing.
Just one more, I mean, this is a political aspect,
Yeah.
but there's no doubt
Mm-hmm.
that if you're in government in this position, you want to leave as many options open going forward, and you also want to set important precedents the first time around. You want to do both. So they are going to want to keep their options open as far as methods, I think including cost effectiveness, even though if they don't generate it themselves the first cycle. But that first cycle, are they going to want to say every single drug, we're just going to take the stipulated % discount, that's our ceiling price, and not go any lower? No. There's no way that an organization or a process is going to want to set its precedent that way. So they are going to want to have some ability to say, the law says we have to have a minimum 25% discount, and we're going to negotiate more.
Mm-hmm.
So how, again, they justify that lower price, how explicit they are, is things that we'll really have to wait. Everybody's saying, give us the rationale. If you're going from 25 to 35, tell us why it wasn't 40 or 30. Give us something to understand as we go forward.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure how far they'll get there the first cycle, but I think they do feel some responsibility for setting precedents that will say we have a reasonable way to go lower. And they're also thinking about the courts. They'll say we have to do it in a way that has some, if you will, rationale that could stand up before a judge who's not a technical specialist, has to have some visceral kind of rationale that makes sense to people.
So could we be reading, a question for you both, I mean, could we be reading some public justification, let's say, that says, in essence, we could just take 25%, but we know, for example, that commercially the discounts on this particular agent may be 40% or something like that, and provide as further justification some reference to clinical effectiveness, comparative effectiveness clinically, or cost effectiveness? Is that the kind of thing we might be reading, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think this will depend drug by drug how this goes. You know, to Steve's point, there's a heavy kind of technical side and then a political side of this. I do think a lot will depend on the comparator they choose and the price of the comparator. There may be cases where there's a cheap generic version, or at least some version that reasonably is a comparator that's relatively inexpensive. So it's quite a bit below the ceiling price. But maybe clinically, there's debates about whether that's the right comparator or in what circumstances it's the right comparator. So I think these are things that we'll have to watch very carefully. But one other point I wanted to make, there's this very important, I think, and interesting question. You read the factors that Congress told CMS they need to consider, the 9 of them. Some of them we would call value-based kinds of factors. The therapeutic advantage of the new drug, the comparative effectiveness of the new drug. And by the way, there's some other things, the degree of unmet need and things like that that are among the factors. Then there are what I'll call cost-based factors. How much research and development costs went into the product? How much federal support for research and development went into the product? The question for CMS is, how do you reconcile these value-based factors with the cost-based factors? Economists like to argue prices should ideally align with value. We want to price as though there were a well-functioning market, which there's not, but we want to price to align with value. That sends the right signals to the innovators that we don't want to price above value because there are better uses of resources, but we don't want to price below value because we want to have the incentives there for the product innovators to bring new products to the market. But the economists would also argue you really don't want to align price with costs. Why? Well, it gives the wrong incentives. If you have really high costs and you have price, well, then you have incentives to just raise your costs. Also, it's difficult to track all of the R&D costs that go way back, and that's just a practical issue. But CMS has given factors on the cost and the value side. So, and they said they'll do it qualitatively. That's what Medicare said in its guidance. But we're all waiting to see what that means. And the final point, I agree with Steve about this precedent-setting nature of these first decisions. CMS is going to be doing this in a very visible and highly charged political environment with lawsuits going on. But and I think it will depend drug by drug. Sometimes they might go right to the ceiling price, and that will be deemed sufficient. But I think in other cases, they will likely go below that based on these other arguments.
Can I follow on to that too?
Sure.
'Cause the cost thing is really interesting because most health economists kind of frowned when they saw that to a certain extent because it doesn't factor in the real world. It's not like drug companies go back and calculate how much they spent and said, okay, that's how much we spent developing this thing, and so we need to get that plus X. It's part of the broader ecosystem, but this has even come up in Europe now, where they've now just proposed in the European Union that companies have to do the same thing to calculate the research and development costs. And if I were in the shoes of the people getting that information, it would have one purpose, which would be to use, if I think that people are going to complain about how low the price is that I want to negotiate for, I want to say, look, they only spent X on development, and they recouped that 8 years ago, plus some. So get off my back. Right? So they've had their fabulous brand phase, they made their reinvestment, they got all their money back, and so let's move forward. So that's my view of how, if it's used, it will be used. Now on the other hand, some of the flexibility or variability that we will see about how hard, if you will, they're going to negotiate, I think is going to have to do with the competitive landscape. So again, if you're a real health system, and this drug is serving an important purpose that cannot be easily served by another drug with the same mechanism of action, let's say, or very, very similar function. I don't want that company to pull that drug. I don't want that drug to go away. And so maybe I'm more likely to be satisfied with the minimum discount. But let's assume I'm negotiating a drug with a mechanism of action where there are 3 other competitors. And yes, patients who are taking that drug, if it went away, they wouldn't be thrilled maybe to switch to a different drug, but it's not going to create a clinical nightmare if one of those 4 drugs with the same mechanism of action suddenly disappears. So maybe that's where I feel comfortable really pushing the limit, and I'll pick the lowest price comparator out of the market basket and say that's the one I'm anchoring on this time, and I want an 80% discount because I'm willing to take the risk that that drug goes away. So again, this gets into not just the psychology, but the reality of negotiating in the context of other drugs and the patient's need, et cetera. But I think that's part of what's going to drive. Now again, how explicit they can be with some of those rationales, that's a tough question.
We'll have to see, yeah.
That's a tough question.
Because that would be an area where you would think they'd want to do a lot of homework with the patient side, right? I mean, non-medical switching, I think as you alluded to, can be very...
Well, it's not right. I guess you could call it non-medical switching. It would be more like you have to switch because there's no, and it would ultimately still be up to the drug company of whether they pull their drug or not. But if that's the counter pressure at the negotiation table, again, that can vary depending on what the other options are.
Yeah.
And just on that point, because I think we'll see cases like this, for the drug companies, it's going to mean a lot of work on their part to differentiate their drugs with real-world data, for example, with arguments about the fact that their drugs, lead to better adherence for patients. Now, whether that's empirically supportable, I mean, that's going to be the question. But I think my point is, we're just going to see this being played out in sort of this intensive way, with a lot more real-world evidence on the table to backstop some of these arguments.
So industry has identified a number of fairly specific issues here. We won't be able to get to all of them here, although we'll touch on others in the second panel. But Peter, one of the things that you've written about is the CMS intends to negotiate around sort of the single agent regardless of the indications for that drug. And and industries come back and said, well, I mean, this is now, may force us to sort of front load the indications for a particular drug before it's launched, or it may create difficulty post-launch as, let's say, clinicians experiment with off-label uses, or a drug that's already out there finds its way to other uses, and the particular implications here for oncology. And you've even expressed that maybe indication-based pricing might be in our future. And I guess for both of you, your take on this sort of single mechanism of action, one price kind of issue here, and whether indication-based pricing conceivably might be a policy option at some point in the future.
Well, we should, I think, just discuss the impacts of a law like this on drug company future innovation, which gets into indications as well. A law like this inevitably will have impacts on drug development and portfolios and everything else they do. How big is the subject of a lot of debate. CBO had a report that said the impact on future innovation, in their view, will be relatively modest. Others have said it will be quite large. And I think we all have to have a kind of measure of humility because we don't know. Also, a law like this will have impacts on innovation, but we should also say the status quo had its own problems. So we're moving to a new system, assuming it survives the current challenges and political changes. What are some of those impacts on innovation? Well, there's a lot of innovation that goes on follow-on indications. That's typically where we learn about how the drug works in different populations over time. Those often come downstream. In oncology, we often see the companies first going after the small indications, the fourth-line therapies to get on the market and then expanding. This law will change a lot of those incentives. There'll be incentives to recoup investments as quickly as possible. There'll be recalculations about whether it's worth going after some of those downstream indications, because by that time the drugs will have gone into this Medicare negotiating process. So the other point to make here is the law excludes orphan drugs, but only orphan drugs with a single indication. That's very important potentially, because we will have disincentives in a way to go after multiple indications for orphan drugs. So I think this is something that we should take very seriously and continue to think about and monitor and question whether we have the balance right here. And I don't think we really know. And again, the status quo had problems, and we're trying to solve certain problems, but the disincentives are something we should look at carefully. Now, whether the system moves to indication-based pricing is a kind of long-standing issue. The drugs may have very different value in different indications, and often do. There are always practical, operational challenges in trying to price differently in these different indications, and those will remain. So I think it's something that we should continue to look at. There may be ways to do it in the future, but I don't know that even if you could do that, that this law would help you, because once you get the drug negotiation, it's going to have implications for all the other indications, presumably, unless they move to some kind of new indication-based pricing, which right now they don't seem to have.
Steve, I don't know if you have a...
Indication-specific pricing makes a lot of sense during the brand phase, not maybe as much during the generic phase, when pricing to value is not the paradigm that people usually think of. And there's no way to operationally get it going anytime soon. It'll be a little bit easier in Part B in some ways than in Part D. But all the the ramifications that Peter talked about are true. Although it's funny, just a few years ago, people were putting out white papers saying the problem is that they're getting too many incentives to create niche, ultra-rare indications to get into the market quickly at a very high price, and then they kind of more slowly make it available or test it in broader populations, which denies people with earlier lines of care the opportunity to use it. There was a sense it was tilted too much that way, and now we're getting the argument that this is going to be tilted too much the other way, that you have to start with your big indication, because that's when the clock starts ticking. Yeah. Again, that has lots of ramifications for VC and early investment, because you have to figure out what that pattern looks like. So it's uncomfortable. It's acutely uncomfortable, because as Peter rightly pointed out, it's really hard to know what the big picture looks like. You can pick any one drug or any one area and kind of think that you know what might be coming. But this is, and it's going to be very hard to prove a counterfactual 10 years from now about how many drugs did or didn't get created for which indications. How did the shift, we will see the shift, if there is one, between orphan and non-orphan, at least initial launches. But I think there's definitely reason for people, especially in the ultra-rare community, to be somewhat concerned, a rare community, because of this, what looks now to be a slightly higher burden, at least, to look for that second indication across different kinds of rare conditions. So we'll just have to see in some ways whether there is either going to be a fix suggested later, or people are just, a lot of people are going to say we just have to wait a few years and see what happens.
Yeah. Yep. Peter, did you?
No, I was just going to say there are a lot of incentives that this law creates, but one of the obvious ones we haven't mentioned yet is it creates incentives to go after biologics, large molecules, as opposed to the small. And whether that's a good idea or whether we have the numbers right in terms of the years after which you get negotiated, I think that's rightly the subject of discussions.
Great. Well, we're getting close to the end. I have other questions, but I do want to look out on the audience and see if any of you here would like to ask a question of the panel. If not, I will.
While you're doing that, I just want to come back to a point you made in your introductory remarks, which is we all tend to be up on panels talking about some of these aspects. The $2,000 a year cap for patients out of pocket is a vastly underappreciated benefit for the American public. It really is going to make a difference for a lot of people with serious disease. And again, that will counterbalance some of the other issues. You'll get better adherence and better uptake on certain drugs. But to me, the fact that we could at least conceive of that balance between doing some kind of price regulation and making sure that that also enhances patients' ability to afford and adhere to drugs is a combination that we do want to see as a best practice, whatever happens going forward.
I tried to do a little surveillance coming into this as to anybody who's got any data yet or making any predictions. I don't know whether either of you are aware of any reasonably well-grounded predictions as to what uptake is now going to look like given these changes in the benefit design, or one eventually
asking
gets.
For evidence, that's unfair. That's a great question.
Un-American.
Actually, well, payers do have internal algorithms that suggest what copay levels lead to less uptake. I have no idea if anybody's done a publicly available calculation around this, but it's considered, at least by anecdote, to be something that will be significant.
Yeah. Yep. Yes.
Maybe a little bit off to the side, but do you have predictions on whether or not resiliency in manufacturing and distribution down the road might play a factor in pricing? Just thinking about the last few years and what we're currently seeing with certain drugs being unavailable for patients. If there's a way to factor that into how the pricing might work.
So question, in case people didn't hear it, is resiliency as in the resiliency of the supply chain and all the disruptive factors that we saw in the last 3 years in manufacturing and distribution. To what extent will that play into the thinking at CMS, to the extent that we know? Again, sort of maybe informed speculation here.
That's a good question. I mean, it's mainly an acute factor for generic drugs at this stage. But again, if there's a drug being negotiated that has really no good alternative, it may be. Again, they'll be afraid to lose a single supplier of a drug that has no easily kind of conceived of alternative.
Because we're still seeing recurring drug shortages, right?
Yeah,
out
worse.
there. Yeah. Exactly. Anybody else who has a question? Oh, here we go. Yep.
What do you think the most likely outcome is of the Merck suit? Is it to establish more of a formula for discounting going forward? Is it to redo the whole thing, or is it nothing?
Since we're both lawyers, we'll take a
Yeah.
crack at that. I have an answer, but Peter, introduce
No, I mean,
you.
I'm not a lawyer, and I'm following this as I read and talk to people. My sense from what I'm hearing is these are relatively weak cases to the extent we can determine that from where we're sitting in terms of First Amendment and Fifth Amendment challenges to this law. There may be other strategic or tactical reasons to bring suits like this. I think a lot will depend on changes in the political landscape. There are other, Tom mentioned, there are other lawsuits that might be coming on procedural grounds, whether it's following, comment periods and routine administrative procedures. So I don't know what else to say about that. I'm guessing, the law survives until Congress makes changes.
Yeah, at least the Merck of the Chamber of Commerce lawsuits, as far as, again, not a lawyer, but the pro-IRA kind of community, if you will, was all ready to come back with why these are kind of ridiculous claims, First and Fifth Amendment. So there was a whole set of emails that started going around saying lawyers had looked at this and here's the rationale why Merck's lawsuit doesn't have any kind of real weight. But the intent is to basically completely eradicate, if you will, the law. It's not to say it needs to be fine-tuned here or there. I guess part of it around free speech could be if we don't have to call it negotiation. I wasn't even really clear what a positive outcome would look like, except, again, that the law gets kind of overturned. But we're in the early days of even the legal aspect. As Peter said, once it actually happens, and there's a procedure that you can then see that you could sue, that will happen too. And the lawsuits will either be that the procedure was arbitrary or that it was very prescribed and they didn't follow it. Those are the kind of two lawsuits you can usually do.
Mm-hmm.
So we may even get both. It's too arbitrary and whatever they said they were going to do, they didn't do. So that's, CMS is going to be in a pretty tight box trying to figure out how to drive a lane through that kind of thicket.
Wendy.
You both mentioned that this is different than sort of the classic health technology assessment, which is usually done at launch as opposed to then 10 years. How do you think health technology assessments that have been done at launch will be used as part of the CMS process, if they will be used, or how do you think the health technology assessment 10 years post-launch should differ from the one done at launch?
It's a big question. Peter?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the CMS will look at the totality of evidence, everything that they have, including what was done, I presume, at launch to the extent it's still relevant. A lot changes in 10 years. Comparatives change, the evidence-based changes, and so forth. I think the big difference is, as I mentioned, there'll just be a lot more real-world evidence available. So there'll be lots of studies looking at differences of comparators on adherence, on outcomes, on cost offsets. There are always questions with that real-world evidence base, as we know well, and lots of issues around bias and selection and confounding and on. But we'll have just a lot more evidence, and there'll be ever stronger incentives for the companies to generate that evidence and use that in their negotiation.
Yeah, I think that is the key also. Again, it also gets back to comparators. There doesn't have to just be one. Comparator is kind of a fancy term. What your competition is. What's the guy against which you are being compared? And again, if you pick some person, if you will, a drug that's a generic, and maybe your drug's a little bit better, if you will, then that makes a huge difference versus comparing it to another brand drug with a price that's way up here. So again, there's no requirement that they have only one comparator. They can say, we looked at 4 different comparators, and then they don't even have to tell you anything else. They can just say, we looked at all 4, and here's our price. Or they could say, we ended up really focusing on one, and it kind of depends on how deep they get. But it's comparators. Real-world evidence also, talk about what's unknown. Real-world evidence is touted as a big difference, but it's still highly doubted by many evidence reviewers when they get it handed to them by a company that has a vested interest in the outcome, because real-world evidence is sometimes easier to frame in different ways that can shine more favorably depending on how you run the analysis. So it's not clear how much weight they will put on real-world evidence because they might feel that it's more uncertain than some of the old clinical trial data that is somehow, if you will, cleaner. So all of that is yet to be determined, but the active use of real-world evidence, assuming this goes forward, is going to be one of the big differences between HTA at launch and HTA 10 years later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thought it, yep, in the back there.
Good morning. Moving forward, how do you think this will impact private health insurers as we move forward, like moving into the future? What's your comments on that?
I'll
How
go
this
first,
will
maybe.
affect private
Okay.
health insurers.
So they don't know. Nobody knows. People kind of assume that there won't be. I've already read articles, though, that say it'll just depend on which branch of medicine we're in, whether there's competition, and whether it's a high Medicare. Again, a lot of the insurers, private insurers, have a large number of Medicare Advantage patients now. So there's still going to be a lot of mix going on. And another feature that is not talked about very much is that the insurers are on the hook now for more of the cost of drugs in what used to be the catastrophic phase. So some people say they're going to have more incentive to be more aggressive in their management of these drugs, however you want to interpret that. But then there's the other question of what's this going to do to launch prices? And that would be true for both private and public insurers. Most people, and I'm one of them, believe that this will only tilt further the acceleration in launch prices we've seen over the last decade as part of a long-term portfolio management strategy, given the likelihood of negotiation 10 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that. And people are looking very hard and will be looking to see what the spillovers to private and commercial employers are. Certainly, launch prices is something we expect to go up, and there's debates about how much can drug companies continue or to increase launch prices, and if they could, why haven't they done it already? There's sort of that discussion. Once Medicare negotiates prices, will commercial payers have sort of reason and evidence and sort of momentum to go down to those prices? We'll be looking at that. So
several states are already launching legislation, at least states. There are individual legislators in states that are drafting laws saying we get what they get. So whatever Medicare negotiates, we want to make sure that our state Medicaid program and et cetera, and also perhaps private insurers in our state get that price. Mm-hmm. So there'll be a lot of activity trying to see if they can draw that lower price into the private market or not.
Great. Well, before I thank Steve and Peter, maybe one last question, and it does tie back to the real-world evidence set of issues. Steve, I think you folks at ICER have some goals around reevaluating products that you may have evaluated at launch, if I'm not mistaken, at some point down the line, which would require some evaluation of real-world evidence at the time. And Peter, as you're suggesting, this is methodologically still a lot of issues out there. Is one priority item that ought to happen at this point that doesn't upset the rapid timetable at CMS on drug pricing negotiation, some concordance, I'll call it that, with the FDA around trying to expedite standards of fit-for-purpose, real-world evidence, that kind of thing? Is there an opportunity here to make some progress on that score?
I don't know.
Data's too dirty.
The use of real-world evidence for indication expansion, which is usually what it's being used for. Sometimes it's being used for initial indications, but very, very rarely, and still with a lot of uncertainty. I do think that if this goes forward and if real-world evidence is taken seriously by CMS, it will completely electrify the world of people who are into real-world evidence. There's a private market there of registries and other groups that are doing work. But there's also going to be a lot of work by the pharmaceutical companies themselves, who have viewed real-world evidence as a nice-to-have for negotiation in some ways with private payers in particular. But now it'll take on a whole new look, and I think it'll become much more important. But I'm not sure that the FDA and CMS would see new purpose in getting together on this, specifically in the short term.
Uh-huh. What do you think, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, if you look at FDA and real-world evidence, 2016, we had the 21st Century Cures Act. Congress telling FDA, we want you to use real-world evidence more intensely. Since then, we've had guidances coming out at FDA, you know, on registries, on electronic medical records, on, you know, trial design and real-world evidence, post-market approval. What we're seeing, as Steve said it, we're seeing FDA in some cases using real-world evidence to expand indications, sometimes as supportive evidence for new indications. Often it's in oncology or rare disease, especially rare disease, where it's hard to do trials, and to using real-world evidence to construct synthetic control groups. So I think there's sort of a journey that FDA is on and that CMS can learn from. There's a lot of reasons to be skeptical of real-world evidence, as Steve suggested, but there's also reasons to believe the evidence base will get better, the real-world evidence base will get better, our data systems will get better, our analytic methods will get better. And so, you know, I think this industry of real-world evidence will continue to evolve.